Well, happy Wednesday evening to you all. Welcome to a ham radio class, a beginning class to get your first ham radio license here in the United States. And we're almost done with the class. And we're going to be talking about Chapter 8 tonight in this book. This is the book that we use, the American Radio Relay League, can't say it, License Manual, the 5th edition. And this is the book. We go chapter by chapter each week. And next week is our last chapter. So we're going to teach you a word tonight that has a relationship to radio and the English language that you're going to find interesting. To get us started, I'm your instructor, Gary, ham radio call sign Whiskey 4 Echo Echo Yankee. And note, I'm in long sleeve shirt tonight because we got the air conditioning fixed. Yay. So it's nice and cool here in the studio. Tonight we're going to be talking about just this chapter, and we're going to get out early because it's a short chapter tonight. But you deserve it because you've been hanging in there. We were talking a little bit before class about, am I going to make it or not? Am I going to understand everything necessary to pass the test? Just keep going. You will pass the test. It will come to you. I don't want to freak you out, but I've had students tell me that they hear my voice in their heads when they take the test. So maybe I'll be in there with you and we'll take it together. Before we go into the questions and material for tonight, let's go to the laptop, Bruce. I want to remind you again that before you take your exam, whether you take it in person or online, you're going to need to obtain a federal registry number. This was the announcement from ARRL originally. You used to be able to use your Social Security number for your first license and then get the FRN automatically, but that's not the way. And so here's the FCC's website, the URL down there below. It's free. Just go to the website and apply for an FRN number. If you already have a GMRS license, you already have an FRN number. Look for that. But it's the number that they use to keep track of the paperwork at the FCC. All right, I promised you a new word. Penultimate. Penultimate. It means next to the last stage. Not the last stage, next to the last stage. And I learned this word from Marconi transmitters at the Voice of America at the Morocco transmitting station. We had some Marconi B6128 transmitters, and we learned how to work on the penultimate stage. So here we are, the next to the last chapter. Chapter 8, Operating Regulations tonight. Next week, we'll be talking about safety in the first hour, and then in the second hour, or second half of the class, we'll be taking a practice test together. That's what PT stands for, not physical training. And then finally, on April the 9th, our very last class, we'll take 2 practice tests together here. So let's get going. Section 8.1 is all about control operators. And when you get your ham radio license, and you will, remember I say it's two licenses in one. You get a license to be a ham radio operator, to operate an amateur radio station, and you also get authorization to build your own amateur radio station at your house or in your car. And the person who is operating the radio station is the control operator. Ham radio stations must always have a control operator. The FCC assumes it's going to be the station owner, but it doesn't have to be. If you've got a friend coming over who's licensed, they can operate your station based on their own license. And so it has to be a licensed U.S. amateur or a foreign alien from another country that has a reciprocal operating permit with the United States, like Canada or some European countries. The whole point of having a control operator is that they're the person responsible for station operations when the station is transmitting. The FCC is concerned about transmitting, and that person must prevent harmful interference from occurring. And that's defined as that which seriously degrades, obstructs, or interrupts a radio communication service, another service, operating in accordance with the radio regulations. So they're all about not interfering with some other service. Now, the control operator can be the station licensee, or it can be designated by the station licensee. I can go, Bruce, I designate you as the control operator for the station. And so Bruce would then take over. And it's the control operator's class of license that sets the operating conditions. So when you get your technician license and you invite me over to your house and say, Gary, you want to operate my station? I say, sure. Since I have an extra class license, I could use your station in the extra class portion of the band. That's what that means. And I'd be using my own call sign and making contacts that way. And even though they're not physically at the site of the repeater, if it's on a mountaintop, for example, repeaters too have a control operator. So ham radio stations must always have a control operator. And if you designate somebody else to be the control operator of your station, you're not off the hook. It's a shared responsibility then that exists between the control operator and the station licensee to prevent interference. And I don't want to belabor a point, but when can a station transmit without a control operator? Never. You must have a control operator. So here's a question for you. Can a technician class licensee be named the control operator of an extra class station and then proceed to operate in the extra class portion of the band? What do you think? You can go ahead and unmute and let me know.
Negative. No.
Yeah, negative, because it's the operator's class of license. So yeah, as a technician, you could come over and operate my station based on your authorization. So and in your frequency ranges, at your power level, etc. So yep, very good. Control point. This is somewhat confusing, but also kind of obvious. The control point for an amateur radio station is the location at which the control operator function is being performed. That's kind of gobbledygook, Gary. Well, it'll make sense when we talk about remote station operations, so hold that thought. Oh, we're up to questions already. So when may an amateur station transmit without a control operator?
Never.
Never. D. That's right.
Yeah.
Yep. And who must designate the station control operator?
Alpha.
Yeah, Alpha is correct. Yep. The station licensee. And what determines the transmitting frequency privileges of an amateur station?
Delta?
Yes, the class of operator license held by the control operator. And what is an amateur station's control point?
C, Charlie.
Yes, it's the location at which the control operator function is performed. And when, under normal circumstances, may a technician class licensee be the control operator of a station operating in an amateur extra class band segment?
Bravo?
Not Bravo. So you've got a technician. They've been designated as a control operator of a station, but can they operate in the amateur extra class band segment? No, they cannot at no time. Now, it is possible if somebody was coming over to my station that they could handle the microphone and the push to talk using my call sign because I'd still retain the control operator function at that time, and they could identify themselves as not being Gary but being somebody else. That's an unusual circumstance. So when the control operator is not the station licensee, who is responsible?
The control operator. D, Delta.
Yes, the control operator and the station licensee are both responsible, 50-50. And who does the FCC presume to be the control operator?
Station licensee.
Yes, absolutely. See, this is kind of logical. All right. Section 8.2, identification. We're talking about station identification here. The rule is that you must identify with your amateur radio call sign every 10 minutes and at the end of a contact. And you must identify in English, and you can do that using Morse code. Morse code is always accepted. Even for brief transmissions without modulation, if you're doing tests at the end, you should transmit your call sign and identifying where the transmission came from. The exception is radio control for models like this huge B-52 model. Oh my gosh. But you don't have to identify at the beginning of a transmission. And so on a repeater, sometimes you will hear people just, start talking. And you'd say, well, that doesn't seem right. The rule is that after 10 minutes go by, they have to then throw their call sign out and at the end of the transmission. So you don't actually have to ID at the beginning. And you use your amateur radio call sign as assigned by the FCC, in my case, Whiskey 4 Echo Echo Yankee. But sometimes, come back to me for a second, Bruce, hams will volunteer to help at events, marathons, or other sporting events, or things like that. And you might have the starting line, and you might have the midpoint, and you might have the finish line. And so you've got hams that are manning those locations and can communicate back and forth, but you don't always know who is where. So you can use tactical call signs. You could say starting line, or midpoint, or finish line. Call them on the radio and say, here is Control Center, Whiskey 4 Echo Echo Yankee. So these are tactical call signs that are used in addition to your amateur radio call sign. But the FCC rules still apply. After 10 minutes, you have to throw in your FCC call sign, and at the conclusion of the transmission. But you may use tactical call signs. You can also use, well, I don't know what, additional identifiers. We'll talk about it here, a self-assigned call sign indicator. Let me turn on my laser pointer here. I'm going to talk about this here in a second, but let's go here. I mentioned Morse code is always allowed. And it used to be some radios were sold with a button on the front panel that you'd push the button and it would send your call sign in Morse code. I don't think they exist anymore. Radio repeaters, though, you'll hear them identify themselves usually with Morse code, sometimes with the synthesized voice. So Morse code is always allowed. And if you're operating in a different region in the United States, it used to be required you had to do this, but you don't have to do it anymore. But if I was from Michigan, for example, and my call sign was Whiskey 8 Echo Echo Yankee, which is an 8-land up in Michigan, then if I was down here in South Carolina, I could operate as Whiskey 8 Echo Echo Yankee stroke 4 or slant 4. Or /4. All of those are acceptable. That it just says that I'm not up north, I'm down in 4 land. Now, you don't hear that so much anymore, but that is allowed. Now, the self-assigned call sign indicator, I've never heard this actually used on the air, but the rule is that you can pretty much pick anything. You can say W8EEY stroke delighted. What? Okay, that would be okay. But W8EEY stroke DL, that would not be allowed because DL is an abbreviation for hams in Germany. That's their call signs start with DL. So that would be confusing. So just be aware of that. I don't think there's a test question on it. You can't conflict with the FCC rules and international prefixes. That's what it's all about. So you're going to get your technician class license, you're going to get on the air, you're going to begin operating, you're going to learn so much because the technician class license is a license to learn. And then you're going to say, I'd like to upgrade to general. And when you upgrade to general class, then you can do this. When you take your general class test and you pass your test, you are immediately given the privileges of a general class operator. All you have to do is identify using your technician call sign, KB4XYZ, stroke AG, or slant AG, or /AG. This, I think, stands for acting general. I believe that's what it means. Also then when you upgrade from general class to extra class, yes, it can happen, then you could be AE. You want to do that anytime that you operate using general class privileges in like the general class portion of a high frequency band. You don't have to do it on a radio repeater because you had full privileges with your technician call sign, unless you want to brag. That's a way to notify people that you upgraded. And there are very few, but there's still some novice license holders out there. And when they upgrade to technician class, they use their novice call sign stroke KT. Okay, some more questions. So what do the FCC rules state regarding the use of a phonetic alphabet for station identification in the amateur radio service? What do you think?
Bravo.
It is strongly encouraged to use phonetics. And when may an amateur station transmit without identifying on the air? There is an exception.
Delta?
Yeah, when transmitting signals to control model craft. That is the one exception. And how often must you identify with your FCC assigned call sign when using technical call signs?
Charlie?
B, Charlie.
Yes, it's the same rule at the end of each communication or after every 10 minutes during a communication. And when are you required to transmit your assigned call sign? You won't get both of these questions on your test. You'll get one or the other.
B, Delta.
Yeah, at least every 10 minutes and at the end of the communication. Same question. So what language may you use for identification when operating in a phone subband for identification?
Charlie?
Because you have a U.S. license, you identify in English. You can carry on the conversation in any language you want, but when it comes time for identification, English. And what method of call sign identification is required for a station transmitting phone signals? Single sideband or FM?
B, Bravo.
Yes. You identify on, using a voice, Whiskey 4 Echo Echo Yankee, or if you've got one of those magic radios, you can push the button and send CW with your call sign. There you go. Or if you can have a Morse code key hooked up, you can do that. CW Morse code is always allowed. So which of the following self-assigned indicators are acceptable when using a phone transmission?
B, Delta.
Yeah, stroke, slant, or slash are all understood. And which of the following is required when making on-the-air test transmissions?
Alpha.
Yes, you are required by the rules to identify with your call sign at the end or the conclusion of the test transmission. All right, interference, section 8.3. You heard this before, but interference is that which seriously degrades, obstructs, or repeatedly interrupts a radio communication service that is operating in accordance with the radio regulations. So we need to avoid interference to other services, and we want to avoid being interfered with. There's interference to you, and there's interference from you. And the most important services that we want to protect are those involved with radio navigation or radio location services, such as used for aircraft, etc. And they operate in a wide frequency range, so we want to make sure that our radios are properly engineered. The designers probably are going to take care of that. But if you suspect you have a problem, find another ham who might have the test equipment to be able to test it out, because we want to make sure that we don't interfere with any of these services. All right, come back to me for a second, Bruce, because I've mentioned this in earlier classes. In any group of people, you're going to have, different types and different sorts. And unfortunately, in ham radio, we have some hams who, while they pass the test, they never really grew up. It's especially apparent when a rare DX station comes on the air, on the HF bands. You tune your radio and say, oh, I want to work them. And then you hear the children who, for whatever reason, were not able to work the DX, so they figure since they couldn't work them, you can't either. And so they will start to interfere with the DX station's transmission deliberately. We call that interference QRM. And so what I'm talking about now is DQRM. That's willful interference. And it's never legal. It is not okay, but it does exist. So I want you to know about that. Now, a less severe issue, but something that also will crop up on the bands, and if you listen on HF frequencies, you'll sometimes hear this. You'll go to a frequency, and like we did last week, we'll say, is the frequency in use? Is the frequency in use? And we'll listen, nothing. Do it again, listen, nothing. We'll start calling CQ or talking and whatnot, and then a voice will come out of nowhere and say, hey, you're on my frequency. What? More often it'll be, hey, we have a net starting on this frequency in about 5 minutes. Can you QSY? Can you change frequencies up maybe 5 kilohertz? Okay, that's okay. That's reasonable, and that's what the FCC wants us to be. Is to be adults about the whole thing, to be reasonable and accommodating and say, sure, I'll be happy to move. But technically, no one has a right to any one particular frequency. Even nets that have met there for 20 years, technically, they don't have a right to that frequency. But we need to be grown-ups about this. So just QSY and move on. All right, here's some more questions. This is going to be a short night tonight. So when is willful interference to other amateur radio stations permitted?
Bravo.
Yeah, bravo. At no time. No good. And which of the following applies when two stations transmitting on the same frequency interfere with each other?
Alpha, the station should negotiate.
Yes, absolutely. We should be adults about it. Oh, you were here first. I'll QSY up. No problem. All right. Section 8.4, third-party communications. What does this have to do? Well, it has to do with back into time when long-distance phone calls were outrageously expensive. And then think about international long-distance phone calls. And the various agencies in various countries had a lot of money invested in infrastructure for telephones and telephone equipment and satellite links and stuff like that. And so to protect their income, ham radio was a thing, but they wanted to put some controls on it. And so communications from a third party is somebody other than the two licensed radio hams that is trying to send a message via them. That's third party. Here's a view of the Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications in the country of Liberia in West Africa. This was my first overseas assignment for Voice of America, and I got my amateur radio license in Liberia. I was Echo Lima 2 Delta Bravo. As I recall, Liberia did not have a third-party agreement with the United States. I could be wrong. I'd have to look that up again. But at the time. And so we could not pass messages from other family members if we were in an amateur radio contact. So that's third-party traffic. And if somebody asks you, will you accept third-party traffic? What you need to know is, does the United States have a third-party agreement with that country? And there's a URL here, and you'll see it on the next page as well, where all of the countries that have official agreements are listed. And this is just a very abbreviated, just the top of the page here, but you can go down and look. Germany, for example, is not on this list. So technically, you cannot pass a message from your husband or wife to somebody else in Germany, for example, if you have a ham radio contact. So just be aware of that. Now, third-party traffic, it's allowed only if the governments of the countries involved allow it. It still exists. With the internet, however, and WhatsApp and all the other stuff, it's blown out of the water, but we still have to know about it and we still have to abide by it. Oh, some more questions. So which of the following restrictions apply when a non-licensed person is allowed to speak to a foreign station using a station under the control of a licensed amateur operator?
Bravo.
Yes, the foreign station must be in a country with which the U.S. has a third-party agreement, as we just discussed. And what is the definition of third-party communications?
Alpha, a message from the control operator to another amateur station control operator.
Yeah, so it is alpha. It's a message from a control operator to another amateur station control operator on behalf of a third person or another person. Three licensed amateur radio stations, B, is possible, and that's okay. You're all amateurs. You're not carrying a message from somebody who is not licensed amateurs. All right, section 8.5, remote and automatic operation. We're just flying through this tonight. That's good. So automatic control, when you hear about automatic control, think of ham radio repeaters. Repeaters and digipeaters use automatic control. And automatic control is defined as devices and procedures that ensure compliance with FCC rules. So radio repeaters might have a control box that looks like this. It's a computer that has programming in it that will monitor the radio repeater and see if anything abnormal is going on. So repeaters use these to minimize or inhibit interference. They still have a control operator. There's still somebody who could dial into the repeater, for example, and exert control over it, but they don't have to be on site. And that's important because we want radio repeaters and their antennas to be up high on a mountaintop or maybe a remote location, because they'll have the best coverage area if they're at altitude. But it might not be easy to get to. Might be impossible to get to in bad weather. So automatic control. All right, I'm going to tell a story here. This is a true story. We have a wide area repeater here in the upstate. You hear the darndest things on repeaters. And one day we heard a husband and a wife. We didn't know what was going on at first. They were in a car and they were arguing. And we kind of surmised later that the ham must have gotten in the car, they had a radio in their car, and they sat on their microphone. And they sat on the push-to-talk switch. Immediately started transmitting. And so everybody who's listening to this wide area repeater gets a chance to hear them arguing back and forth for a period of about 6 minutes. Then the automatic control of the radio repeater realized something is wrong. Transmissions shouldn't go this long without somebody else coming in. And so the repeater announced in a synthesized voice, "Repeater, time out." And then the repeater went off the air for a period of about a minute, 2 minutes. And then the repeater came back up. And they were still going at it. So, okay. Eventually they realized, and he stood up or whatever, got the mic out, and we never did find out who it was. We don't really want to know who it was, but watch out, be careful. If you put a radio in your car, that could be a problem. So that's automatic control. That was the repeater timing out when it realized something isn't quite right here. Remote control is control of a radio from a distance. And it used to be that people would actually put up VHF or UHF links from their home maybe to their station location, which could be 10, 20 miles away. And these VHF links provided voice and control functions. Well, now there's the internet. And the internet is taken over for everything. And so now you can actually control your ham radio station via the internet. It used to be you had to have special equipment. Now it's almost, in modern radios, something that's expected. But here we have, for example, a radio front panel that is connected to a box called Remote Rig. Remote Rig then goes out to the internet and over to another Remote Rig box, where it goes to the radio and controls the radio functions. My friend Matt, NU4E, had a station in Germany with a Kenwood TS480 that was operating exactly in this way. So he could be here in the United States, but using his German call sign, he could operate his station over in Germany. My radio downstairs in the workshop is my Flex 6600. That's one of my radios. And Flex sells their radios as being radio servers. You'll notice there's no controls at all on the front panel of this radio. It assumes you're going to be controlling the radio via a computer program. They provide one free, it's called Smart SDR, or via a Maestro controller. And Bruce, if you'd take the multi now, so I'm going to give you a behind the scenes. This is my point of view here in the classroom. Here's my laptop with the PowerPoint presentation. Here is the Flex. which is downstairs, one floor below in my workshop. So this is an example of remote control. The station, the transmitter is elsewhere, it's down below, but the control point is right here because this is where the control function is being accessed. So just wanted to show you that. Remember, the control point is the location where the control function takes place, and it's defined as local control, even though the control point is, someplace in another room, or even you can control it with your iPad or something like that. So additional rules and practices. Remember, we're here in operating regulations. Originating stations are responsible for transmission content. So the conversation we overheard between the husband and the wife wasn't so spicy or racy, but it could have been. And if it had been, the radio repeater operator would not have been responsible. The originating station, the guy who sat on his microphone, would have been responsible for the content. Originating stations are responsible for transmission content. More questions? Which of the following is an example of automatic control?
Delta D?
No, we're talking about automatic control.
Alpha repeater?
Yes, a repeater. A repeater, remember, has got that control box, repeater timeout, that senses when there's something wrong based on programming inside of it. That's automatic. There's nobody involved pushing any buttons or whatnot. It's taking care of itself. So repeaters use automatic control. And which of the following are required for remote control operation? Read carefully.
Delta?
Delta is correct. The control operator must be at the control point, no matter where that is. A control operator is always required, and the control operator must, in this case, indirectly manipulate the controls. They're not right there on the radio. Some radios, like the Flex, don't have direct controls, so they have no choice. So all of these are correct. So which of the following is an example of remote control as defined in Part 97?
C. Chairman.
Well, and that's why I don't like this question, because when we hear remote control, we think of our model planes or model things like that. No, per Part 97, when they talk about remote operation or remote control, the best example for that is operating a station over the internet using one of these fancy radios. But I understand why you answered that way, because I don't think it's the best question. So who is accountable if a repeater inadvertently retransmits communications that violate FCC rules?
Delta?
Not Delta.
Alpha.
It is Alpha. The control operator of the originating station is solely responsible. The repeater operator is harmless in this case. He was just repeating something coming from the originating station. All right, prohibited transmissions. It is prohibited for you to communicate directly with U.S. military stations, except on Armed Forces Day, which is the third Saturday in May. That is the only time that amateur stations may and are encouraged to communicate with U.S. military radio stations. And how this works is you'll get from the ARRL a list of frequencies and times that military stations will be transmitting on military frequencies. and you can tune your radio over to listen on the military frequency and the frequencies that they'll be listening in the amateur radio band. So you still will be transmitting in the amateur radio band, but you'll be doing a cross-band communication with U.S. military. Only one time a year, that's on Armed Forces Day. You can sell your radio and other equipment over ham radio. In fact, our Caesar's Head repeater on Wednesday nights has a regular swap and shop. So you can talk about the sale of amateur radio equipment as long as it's not your business. It's something you do on an irregular basis. Common sense would say that obscenity is prohibited. It's more than George Carlin's 7 words you can't say on the radio, so please just use common sense. Retransmissions of other broadcasts are prohibited with the exception of space stations, satellites, auxiliary stations, the remote receivers for repeaters, and repeaters themselves. They can retransmit other signals. In fact, that's a repeater's whole job, is to retransmit other signals. You cannot operate your ham radio station for money. Although you may operate a ham radio station, let's say you're a teacher in a public school and you're teaching physics and you want to tell your students about radio, so you can operate your station at the school, that's okay. And the teacher still gets a salary from the school, but they're not using the station to make money in this regard. Music. Transmission of music is prohibited. This goes back, however, to the Mercury and Gemini and Apollo space missions, where NASA made available to ham radio stations a feed of their control circuit that they could rebroadcast so that everybody could participate, everybody could listen in on the things that were going on with the spacecraft. And remember where they used to wake up the astronauts, if you're as old as I am, they used to wake them up with music. And so that music was okay to retransmit. So that's where this rule comes from. You cannot transmit music on amateur radio unless it's incidental to the retransmission of manned spacecraft activities. And then codes and ciphers. You're not allowed to use codes, ciphers, scrambling, anything that would obscure communications, with 2 exceptions. If you're going to be controlling an RC model, look, radio control, not remote control, radio control, okay, let's say that. Or if you're controlling a space satellite carrying amateur radio. In those cases, they don't want the drone or whatever to be taken over, or they don't want the satellite to be hijacked, so you are allowed to use codes and ciphers in those 2 instances. Can you do news gathering using amateur radio? No, that's prohibited, with the exception when life or property is at stake. So if there's an emergency, like we recently had Hurricane Helene going on here in western North Carolina and the upstate of South Carolina, and telecommunications was down. Cell towers were gone. So amateur radio did get involved in some news gathering, promoting, passing along information about survivors, things like that. But as a general rule, you're not allowed to use amateur radio stations for news gathering possibilities. Likewise, you're not allowed to broadcast. The FCC defines that as transmitting to the general public. That is prohibited, with an exception, of course, all the exceptions, if you're transmitting code practice, Morse code signals for code practice, or ham radio information bulletins, or transmissions necessary for emergency communications. So you're not supposed to be transmitting to the general public, rather we're just a point-to-point from ham radio station to ham radio station. Even more rules. When there's a commercial communications channel available, amateur radio is not supposed to be a substitute for that. So if 911 is available and you need to contact the police, use 911. On the other hand, like I mentioned, with Hurricane Helene, when the cell towers and everything were down, you may need to use amateur radio to call for emergency communications or to substitute for otherwise available commercial communications. Questions again. Wow. So under which of the following circumstances are one-way transmissions by an amateur station prohibited? What is the, what do they not want you to do? This is a bad question. Under which of the following circumstances are one-way transmissions by an amateur station prohibited? They're talking about broadcasting. You're not supposed to be broadcasting. When is it permissible to transmit messages encoded to obscure their meaning? Charlie, only when transmitting control commands to amateur station authorized to transmit music using a phone transmission, voice transmission. Yeah, when incidental to the authorized retransmission of manned spacecraft communications. So this goes back a ways. And when may amateur radio operators use their stations to notify other amateurs of the availability of equipment for sale or trade? Yeah, when you're selling ham radio equipment, yeah, and not on a regular basis. It's not your business. And what, if any, are the restrictions concerning transmission of language that may be considered indecent or obscene?
Alpha.
What did you say?
Bravo.
Bravo, yes. Any such language is prohibited. And automatically retransmit the signals of other amateur stations.
Delta.
Yes. Repeaters, for sure. Auxiliary stations are remote receivers for repeaters. And space satellites, they may actually retransmit a range of frequencies, so they can repeat. So repeaters, auxiliary stations, and space stations. In which of the following circumstances may the control operator of an amateur station receive compensation for operating that station?
Bravo.
Yes, when the communication is incidental to classroom instruction at an educational institution. And when may amateur stations transmit information in support of broadcasting, program production, or news gathering?
Alpha?
Yes, when such communications are directly related to the immediate safety of human life or protection of property, those two things. And how does the FCC define broadcasting for the amateur radio service?
B. Delta.
Yes, transmissions intended for reception by the general public. And ladies and gentlemen, you have made it to the end of Chapter 8. Pat yourself on the back. I want you to please use the American Radio Relay League's review website. Come back to the laptop just for a second, Bruce. Here's the URL down there at the bottom. It's now time for you to start maybe taking some practice tests. We will go over Chapter 9 next week. That's safety, so there are some questions you won't have reviewed yet. You can go to the chapters and review the questions that way, but we want you to just get familiar with test taking. It'll help you to develop confidence. You'll feel better about things. And if you have questions about things that still aren't clear, bring them to class next week or the week after, and we'll try to clarify them for you. Before we get out of here tonight, are there any questions or comments? Let me go ahead and get rid of the spotlight here. Questions from anyone?
I've got one real quick one, Gary.
Yes, please.
Auxiliary, that word, that was one of the last few questions you went
Yeah,
over, and I'm sorry,
right.
I don't remember. But can you just tell me what an auxiliary station or auxiliary is?
Yeah, come back to me for a second. So, radio repeaters, especially if they're in hilly areas, can have blind spots. They can have areas that are shaded by terrain where the signals can't reach them and they can't hear signals from that region. So sometimes repeater operators will put up receivers at a remote location and then link that back to the main repeater on a UHF link or something like that. That remote receiver is called an auxiliary station. That's how I want you to be thinking about it. And so that is allowed to receive somebody else's transmission and then rebroadcast it on another frequency to get back to the repeater. So repeaters can retransmit, auxiliary stations can retransmit, and then satellites in space also retransmit signals coming back down to Earth. So those are the three allowed.
So I have a question.
Yes, please.
So you said when we are having a conversation, we're supposed to say our call sign every 10 minutes. Do we just say it? Do we say, here's my call sign? What do we say?
So yeah, you'll be usually it's when you are talking for a little bit and you maybe are communicating with somebody else and you expect somebody else to come back to you at the end of that. So the weather is good here. How about for you, Bruce? Whiskey 4 Echo Echo Yankee. Then you stop transmitting. That's all you need to do is at the end of your comment or statement or whatever, just throw your call sign in, and they're not super strict on the 10-minute rule, but that's the guideline. And then, of course, at the end of the transmission. All right, Bruce, I'll see you next time. 73, Whiskey 4, Echo, Echo, Yankee. Boom.
Yeah.
Doing great. You're doing better than you think. All right. Come back to us next week, please, for Chapter 9 on safety. Until then, let me say 73. See you next time.
73.
73.